there seems to be a bit of quasi-official hostility towards the notion that Australia might have a pragmatic policy of engagement to, gasp horror, Russia. And Tony is challenging this. I'm well disposed towards Russia right at the moment because I love the film festival. Who here was at the Russian Film Festival recently? Leaving Afghanistan, Odessa and Beanpole. Weren't they splendid movies? Weren't they splendid movies? Beanpole, not a cliche in it. And what an evocation of how Leningrad must have been in 1945. And what a measure of the endurance of the Russian people. And in that spirit, a welcome tonight to the new Russian Consul General, Igor Azayev. And let's welcome him to Sydney. He's all welcome. And I've just done my second reading of Anna Karenina on Audible, which is a great way to devour novels from beginning to end. And I'm of the view that it's got to be the finest novel ever written in any language, Anna Karenina. Now, Tony, you ended Return to Moscow fairly gloomily with an account of how the Western Alliance, and I quote you, is now trapped inside its own falsely created alternative reality of Putin's Russia. And except for a few lonely outsiders, and you list Kissinger among them, the West's elite thinking about Russia is frozen in hostile prejudice. Russia, by contrast, has a cooler, more fact-based view of the world and its own role in it. And it retains an up-to-date nuclear weapons deterrent capability. What was the start of this new Cold War, the West versus Russia?
It's a complicated question. In a way, it began with the broken promise by Western presidents Reagan and Bush to Gorbachev that if Gorbachev allowed the reunification of Germany at the end of the Cold War, NATO would not advance beyond East Germany. That promise was repeatedly broken under Clinton and his successors, to the point where NATO is now exercising within sight of the Russian border in the anti-Russian states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And in the anti-Russian failed state of Ukraine, there are NATO arms deliveries to the Ukrainian government. So within 500 miles of Russia, of Moscow, there are hostile forces, or potentially hostile forces. And this is what 26 million Soviet citizens, majority of whom were Russian, but also many other nationalities as well, died as combatants and non-combatants in World War II. And you know, when Russia had the 70th anniversary of the victory over Nazism, every NATO country boycotted that event in Moscow. I think that was the point, Bob, where I finally decided that I had to take sides in this situation. It's not something that you can sit in the middle of the seesaw and say, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, which is what I spent a lot of my life doing as a diplomat. I had to take a position, and it was a moral position, essentially, that it's not right for the Western world to be ganging up on Russia in this way. And everything that I've done since then has been really pursuant to that. But let me just say a little more, if I may, before I hand back to you. I stumbled into a war zone accidentally, because when I went back to Russia in 2016 let's get this right, 2016 for the first time, essentially for many, many years, I didn't realize the extent of the Western disinformation war taking place against Russia. I couldn't understand why there was so much hostility welling up towards Russia. And it's only very recently, comparatively over the last year, that I've realized that there is a disinformation narrative being sedulously crafted in Washington and London to basically make Russia look bad, try to demoralize Russia, try to create rifts in the population, to try to foment regime change as if that were possible. And I stumbled into this war zone. And this isn't me saying this. After there was an amazing leak of data by a group called Anonymous from a British disinformation agency financed by the British government called Integrity Initiative, I like those words, very Orwellian ring to them, I realised that this isn't accidental for my Russian friends at the China. This is real. There is a determined effort to undermine Russia. You see it in the Ukraine. You see it in the story of the Skripals. You see it in Syria with the chemical warfare attacks alleged by the mercenary White Helmets organisation, whose British leader just either suicided or was pushed off his balcony in Ankara, in Istanbul. So it's a murky world we're getting into here. It's a very Le Carre world. Over to you, Bob.
Yeah, well, let's deal with, I'll push back a bit and challenge you on three things. One is Crimea, the other is MH17, and the one we'll start with is the one you devote quite a bit of attention to in your book, that is the Skripals. Now, you're really adopting a contrarian view.
Absolutely. I'm saying that Skripals was a false flag operation by British intelligence designed to do several things. Firstly, to upset the forthcoming Russian-hosted Soccer World Cup, which was a magnificent success. Secondly, to prepare the ground for a disinformation narrative about Syria. And thirdly, I forget the third one, to incommode Putin, I would guess. How did they do it? Well, they knew a month before the two Russian alleged operatives came to London to see Salisbury Cathedral, allegedly, that they were coming. They have to apply for visas a month in advance. They must have picked up that these men were operatives of the Russian intelligence agency. They knew they were going to Salisbury. They knew that Skripal was living in Salisbury. And I think they thought, here's an opportunity to strike a few blows. So the narrative of how the Skripals were allegedly poisoned is completely incredible. Because if this Novichok was used, smeared on the doorknob of the Skripal's house, it would have poisoned half of the population of Salisbury. It's a desperately lethal agent which in the most microscopic quantities will kill. It didn't kill the Skripals. Yulia appeared 2 months later in a video, looking pretty healthy, I have to say, since which time they disappeared completely. Where are the Skripals? Until they're produced, we have very good reason to doubt the whole narrative, because I don't believe that at least Yulia, and possibly Sergei as well, are voluntarily in the West. I think they're being held in some way. And the most damning thing of all, when the British, 3 weeks after the event, sent the samples in test tubes to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, they went to a very reputable laboratory in Spitz. Somehow or other, the Russians got hold of the Spitz technical reports, which show amazing things. Firstly, that there was Novichok in the samples, but it had only been put there within the last 2 weeks. It was fresh Novichok. It had been obviously interfered with while in British government custody. Secondly, there was another nerve agent there, a temporary incapacitating nerve agent called BZ, which was in the NATO armories, which produced exactly the same symptoms as were experienced, as we are told, by the Skripals. So they were temporarily poisoned. The head of British Army nursing was conveniently in attendance near the park bench where they collapsed. They were restored to health, and the false narrative got underway with huge consequences.
Wow.
Now, is there anyone else in the West, any independent voice taking the same line? Is there anyone in investigative journalism, in any corner of the media, who's intent on picking through the evidence you've presented and putting the challenge to British intelligence?
There is alternative media, but mainstream media have essentially swallowed the false narrative. And I've studied this closely, and it's very much the subject of this second book. Return to Moscow was more of a travel memoir. and a celebration of Russian culture and literature. This second book is exclusively political. The false narrative starts, I don't know whether anybody likes opera. I love opera. There's an opera by Rossini called The Barber of Seville. There's an aria in it called La Calumnia, calumny. It's a very funny aria where it starts off with a whisper. Have you heard? Have you heard? And the whisper gradually swells in this wonderful Rossini style, being transferred from person to person. And in the end, everybody on stage is gesticulating wildly and singing at the top of their voice. That's La Calumnia. and this is what happens. You don't need a lot to start a disinformation narrative. You need what's called a cluster of influence. This is Colonel Christopher Donnelly's term of British intelligence, a cluster of influence, to get a little rumour going. And before you know where you are, it's got legs, and it just runs of its own momentum. So, to the point where I really don't know who are the knowing initiators of these false stories and who are the people who've simply credulously swallowed them and magnified them. I just know it's happening.
Well, let's switch to another subject, equally contentious, and an issue in Russia's relationship with the West, and that's the Malaysian Airliner shot down. There are Australians among the 298 killed on board. You know the arguments, our audience knows the arguments backwards and forwards between Russia denying that armaments it had provided pro-Russia militia in eastern Ukraine were responsible for this, and the consensus Western view. Now, what way are you going on this, Tony? Are you maintaining a diplomatic neutrality, or are you siding with the Russians?
I'm saying that the way in which the Joint Investigative Tribunal has been handled is totally legally suspect. Let me say what I mean by that. You had a situation where a plane was shot down over a war zone in which military aircraft were being shot down at the same altitude at which these civilian aircraft were travelling, and incomprehensibly, the Ukrainian Civil Aviation Authority instructed them to go on flying over this zone, which of course was part of Ukrainian territory. Now, why on earth would the Ukrainian Civil Aviation Authority irresponsibly instruct not just Malaysian Airlines but several other airlines to continue flying at that altitude over that war zone with artillery shells going up against military aircraft all the time? That's the first point. Second point, within 12 hours of the tragedy, the American Secretary of State went on air to say, I've seen the videos, I've seen the photographs, I have no doubt it was the Russians. The photographs have never been produced, the videos have never been produced. Why not? Why not be transparent about this? Thirdly, why was Ukraine immediately invited onto the Joint Investigative Tribunal chaired by the Netherlands, whereas Russia was ostentatiously not invited? Not even Malaysia was invited, the country that owned the airline, which went down. Amazingly enough, a Malaysian police team very quietly went into Ukraine and very quietly went down to the dissident-held area where the plane went down, talked to the dissident forces down there, and were given the black boxes. And it's only when they brought the black boxes back to Kiev and said, hey, we've got the black boxes, if you want to see them, you'd better invite us onto this tribunal, that they were belatedly invited onto the tribunal. Final point, Mahathir, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, recently said, I am not settled in my mind who shot down this plane. It could have been Russia, it could have been Ukraine, it could have been the dissidents. So, look, it's an open question to me. But do you see any of this in our mainstream media? Not at all.
Okay, I'm Minister for Foreign Affairs, you're head of the Russian desk in Canberra, and we've got a meeting in my office dealing with the news of the day, which is Russia going into Crimea, settling a border dispute by mobilising its armed forces, taking the Crimea. We're all conscious of the history of Crimea, the artificial separation of the Crimea from Russia under Khrushchev, it being given to, in the days under the umbrella of the Soviet Union, it being gifted to Ukraine. It seemed a theoretical matter at the time, but with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it assumes a different significance. What advice would you be giving me for the statement I would have to make that day as Foreign Minister on Australia's attitude towards what Putin's government had done in taking Crimea and bringing it back into the Russian Federation? Subject, of course, I grant this, to the commitment to a referendum.
I'd be giving you context. I'd be saying that what's been going on in Ukraine over the last few years has been a deliberate American regime change operation involving $5 million, involving people like the American ambassador, a senior diplomat, Victoria Newland, a Vice President Joe Biden and his corrupt son Hunter Biden, working for a Ukrainian oil company. They were basically trying to separate Ukraine from neutrality in the East-West situation and bring it firmly under the aegis of NATO. And this culminated in a regime change operation, a violent regime change operation in Maidan Square, involving Georgian trained snipers who, after about 3 months of peaceful protest in the square, precipitated the final clash by assassinating numbers of Ukrainian police, thereby precipitating a violent crash. Snipers who were working from rooftops. And the president fled. A new government came in which was quite clearly determined on Russophobic policies to make the very large Russian-speaking minority in the Ukraine, and particularly in Crimea, which is almost entirely Russian-speaking, feel very frightened. And Crimea, of course, is the largest Russian war mortar naval base in the world, Sevastopol. It operated under a different sovereignty. It still was Russian, even though Crimea at that time was Ukrainian and had been, incidentally, for about 40 years given to Ukraine by Khrushchev, himself a Ukrainian. Sorry, this is all complicated. But essentially, there was a strong case for protecting the referendum in Crimea. And to return to Bob's question, the right course of action for the Australians would have been to say something diplomatic about calling on all sides to observe peace, etc.
There would have been an argument at that meeting in my office in Canberra by others who would have said, Minister, Australia's got no alternative but to condemn what is the first serious attempt since 1945 to change borders in Europe by force.
Well, I would have once again quoted context. I would have said Russia has been experiencing decisive threats to its national sovereignty for the last 20 or so years. The more Putin fights back for the national sovereignty and security of his country, the more he's being inaccurately portrayed as an aggressor. Putin has never tried to make any part of Ukraine part of Russia. He simply said we must find a solution to the problems of Ukraine that respects the rights of all Ukrainians, including those of Russian ethnic and linguistic background. Crimea has gone. It's water under the bridge. It'll never go back to Ukraine.
That's true, I concede you that, but I'm just, in terms of the language of international relations, is it really an option for Australia? Would it really have been an option for Australia not to have condemned a change of European borders by force? Not a change fought through the UN, not a change that emerged from some international commission, but a change brutally given effect overnight. Isn't it the fact that words though they were, we would have had to have used words to indicate that we cannot approve of the settlement of a dispute like this outside the realm of international law?
Well, there are degrees of indignation, and I would have advised the lowest possible indignation, to be honest. This sort of stuff is happening all over the world all the time. I don't want to use whataboutism arguments, but I mean, what about Venezuela? What about Bolivia? What about Hong Kong? stuff is happening all the time.
This was a change in borders, though. It's not an attempt to influence. It's a moving an army to say, no, this belongs to us, regardless of what the Security Council might say. We're asserting this by the mobilisation of our armed forces. Now, Tony, I just put to you, how could we do anything other, even if it's just for the record, but to register our objection to that notion?
I guess we would have had to say something. When you speak of moving an army, the army was already there. I mean, Sevastopol is and was a Russian naval base. And so it was just a matter of people going out from Sevastopol, which was in Crimea, to other parts of Crimea, and ensuring that the referendum was conducted in peace and security. And the referendum had incredibly overwhelming results, and these were not fake results, I'm quite sure. When I went to Crimea 2 years ago and I met the Crimean First Minister in Simferopol, the capital, I was absolutely convinced by everything I saw that Crimea was a place of peace, that it was very happy to have been moved from Ukrainian jurisdiction to Russian jurisdiction.
Let's grant that. No argument on that score. It is the diplomatic language that I don't think could have been avoided by Australia when it comes to that important principle of international law. We can't make a point about other parts of the world if we're going to pass it up in respect of Crimea. But if we can just go back to Ukraine, do you accept the existing borders between Russia and Ukraine? And if so, what is to be said about Russian support for militia in the Donbass basin, seeking what? To carve out a pro-Russian autonomous region there, or what?
Ukraine has always been a very ethnically and culturally, linguistically diverse community. What was happening under the American regime change operation was to try to impose an ideology of Ukrainian monism, the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian heroes. Half of them were Nazi collaborators, but that didn't matter. They were becoming the new heroes. And that huge slice of Ukraine's population who were ethnically Russian, ethnically Jewish, ethnically Tatar, ethnically Greek, ethnically Romanian, ethnically Hungarian even, they were basically told, you're going to become Ukrainians, get used to it. People were being told, if you want to get married, it's got to be done in the Ukrainian language. If you want to get a job as a post office clerk, you've got to apply in the Ukrainian language. This was ugly stuff. And Putin was saying quite reasonably, hello, this is a neighbouring country of Russia. It's almost part of Russia, has been for centuries. We can't stand idly by and let this happen. So what he's doing in eastern Ukraine is supporting a movement by the people there to say we have rights in the Ukraine, we have language rights, we have cultural rights, and they have to be protected. He's never tried to take the eastern provinces out of Ukraine.
So the militia that's fighting there, the pro-Russian militia that's fighting there, have they ever clarified that what they're fighting for is autonomy, cultural and self-government autonomy in those terms?
Countless times. And it was initially just an argument of words. After the event in Maidan Square, that pretty quickly the Eastern Ukrainian politicians expressed their concern and said, we don't want to have any part of this and we want to have our rights protected. It was a key decision was by Poroshenko in April, 2 months after the Maidan Square coup d'etat, to basically send the whole Ukrainian army and air force into the eastern provinces to suppress what was a civil protest movement. And most of the fatalities and the destruction of cities, Luhansk and Donetsk, was a result of that incredibly strong bombing and artillery barrage in those weeks. And the figures for refugee numbers, the figures for deaths, the figures for injured are staggering. This is a major war in Europe.
You rightly point out that Kissinger, and you might add another great, perhaps the greatest American theorist of international relations, Mearsheimer, both of them have advocated a Finlandization of Ukraine. That is, that the West concede neutrality, no recruitment for NATO, and no recruitment for the European Union when it comes to Ukraine. And you remind me of the timeline you provided me, which is very helpful, that Kissinger had given a lecture in Moscow in 2016 calling for détente, policy his name will always be associated with back in the time of the Soviet Union when he was Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford, calling for détente, but urging the West not to extend its influence, seek to extend its influence into Ukraine through the EU or through NATO. How far have we removed from that, or is that still possible as an accommodation between Russia and the West?
Your question takes us from Moscow to Washington, unfortunately. When Trump was elected against Hillary Clinton, who, without doubt in my mind, was a warmonger and a hater of Russia, whereas Trump came to office with vague ideas in his rather muddled mind. Why can't we and the Russians get on? Surely we can be friends. There was a moment there when Kissinger was thought of as having influence over Trump, and he actually met Trump a few times in Trump Tower, and they had conversations. This, my second book, goes into what exactly happened afterwards. And what's happened, unfortunately, is that Trump has been, to my mind, neutralized by the American military-industrial intelligence, academic, call it what you will, deep state. He's now basically a client of the deep state, as represented by Pompeo, and he doesn't have much freedom of action anymore. He can't even pick up the phone to Putin. He can't have a summit meeting with Putin without having to justify himself that he hasn't become a Putin puppet. There's a poisonous anti-Russian atmosphere in Washington now, and we, of course, get the backwash of that in Canberra. And I would say that we are now victims of an anti-Russian narrative that is going to be very, very hard to shift.
Let me put something to you. I heard from a pretty independent American think tanker. I heard this at a conference in China. He said there's a consensus in Washington that it's not worthwhile even attempting a reset of relations with Russia. He says that's now the consensus. And he said Washington's of that view because of the undoubted Russian interference in the 2016 American presidential election. That's a complex area, and I've got some views on it that I might entertain you with in a moment. But he said it was tactically brilliant of Putin to flip the results of the 2016 election. Tactically brilliant, but strategically dumb. Because while you had fun defeating Hillary, you brought about a consensus in Washington that Russia is our enemy. And no country, not Russia, no country wants to do that, be in that position without a very strong cause. Was it too smart by half for Russia to pull off that intervention? I suppose simply because they had the capacity to do it and they saw Hillary as an irritant.
Russia's a complex place. It doesn't basically wait for orders from Putin every morning what everybody's going to do. It's a modern, advanced, complicated place with a complicated information technology IT scene. I have no doubt that there were certain trolls, Russian computer experts who played games, as computer experts in all parts of the world play games. You know, they like to troll, they like to hack, they like to do all those things. I don't think it had a major impact on the American election, and I don't think that Putin has ever acknowledged that anything the Russian state did would have been intended to have a major impact on the American election. He basically says, look, whatever you've done to yourselves. He was glad Hillary wasn't elected, that's quite right, he was glad. He was expecting good things of Trump, which I think he's been somewhat disappointed in. But look, to expect that the whole great power relations between the two nuclear-armed states that could blow us all to kingdom come, who are teetering closer and closer to war by accident and miscalculation, this isn't a game anymore. I mean, the point I'm trying to make in both my books is America and Russia have to have a dialogue based on mutual respect. And to keep on putting Russia in the sort of the accused box and saying, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? It's impossible to conduct relations with a great state, any great state. Bob could talk about China, but we're not launching a book on China tonight. You cannot conduct diplomacy when you start with those sorts of attitudes.
Yeah, we've got to accommodate an American psychology. Bill Clinton said this. I remember his visit to Sydney a year after he'd ceased to be president. I remember the date precisely. It was the Sunday night before September 11th. And in a relatively small charity fundraiser, Clinton said, talking to a Chinese Australian, he said, you know, there are some people in my country who think America must always have enemies. And that's a great truth about America, and you cannot understand America unless you understand that concept. I speak to someone who studied America for decades and been very fond of America until recently. You cannot understand America unless you understand a deep desire to have enemies. Norman Mailer said to me, how nice it is to drop names like this. Norman Mailer said to me, he said, at the end of the Cold War, there are all sorts of iron filings in the air in America. They're all being directed at the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, they were looking for a new target. And it's almost there's almost a joyful feeling in the air in Washington when they can tick off Iran, which under Obama, America had been accommodating with a nuclear agreement. They've got Iran, they've got Russia lined up. James Clapper, in the end of the third of the Four Corners series on Trump and Russia, said, looking into the camera, I see Russia as an existential threat to the United States, which is a clinically insane comment. But they've got Russia, and they're working overtime to enlist China, not as a rival, not as a sometime strategic competitor and sometime collaborator, but to have China painted as an enemy. And there are people in the Congress like Cruz and Marco Rubio who are delighted beyond measure by the fact that Iran, Russia and China can be seen as enemies, and we can be back to a unifying Cold War spirit that on the way through will help the Republican Party. So I concede that about America. And I also think it's worthwhile pointing out when this issue comes up, that instead of complaining about Russian intervention, America would be better off improving its own electoral system. So it's less prone to a few Facebook posts and leaked emails, like having something comparable to our Commonwealth Electoral Commission, the Australian Electoral Commission, instead of having seedy state officials run national elections state by state, not having voter suppression laws to stop the poor and minorities turning out, reducing the turnout, and having, of course, that awful outdated and freakish electoral college that will turn a popular vote majority into a minority, into a deficit. America picks up its own electoral system, but Tony, I will press you with this. Can it be seen as anything other than a hostile act for one state to intervene in the electoral process of another? Isn't this sort of laboratory designed to produce in the Americans a paranoid and forceful reaction?
It would be if it happened, but I'm maintaining that it didn't happen. And people like Stephen Cohen, who's a world authority on American-Russian relations, maintains it didn't happen. Mearsheimer doesn't think it happened. I agree totally with Bob on America's need for an existential enemy. They're being very reckless because by making Russia and China their existential enemies, they're driving Russia and China closer together more rapidly than either country might have wanted to go. We are seeing now real amity between Russia and China. We saw Xi and Putin making pancakes for each other in Siberia in the middle of the major military exercises up there. We see joint long-distance flights by strategic bomber forces, Chinese and Russian, flying together, testing the Korean and Japanese defences all the way down through that northern Pacific. We're seeing the ASEAN countries, India, Pakistan, setting aside their differences to see what the Russian-Chinese Eurasian economic cooperation schemes offer to them. The world is changing so fast. And we, Australia, are left in a discontented, insecure little rump of Anglo-American-led countries. And in a few years' time, we're going to scratch our heads and wake up and think, why did we allow ourselves to be marginalised like that?
Because that's a very valuable point, and if we push it a little further, there was America with the opportunity of doing a reverse Kissinger. And around about, during the lead up to the inauguration, I know that there were Chinese who speculated that their old friend Kissinger was now advising Trump to recruit Russia as a friend, and in a mirror image of what had happened under the Nixon administration, to peel Russia away from China and to isolate America's more serious rival, more powerful rival, China. And there was serious speculation that the Chinese were almost expecting this to happen to them. But in the burst of anti-Russian fury that took over in Washington months into the Trump presidency, it became impossible. So America has denied itself the opportunity for some very playful diplomatic footwork that would challenge China, its more serious rival, it's the bigger economic challenger, by recruiting Russia, by having a more cooperative approach with Russia. Back onto Australia, we've made ourselves, of all America's allies, I've made this point publicly, we've made ourselves the one that's got to have the most adversarial relationship with China. Now, why can't we have a prime ministerial visit when the Japanese can? When the Indians, an American partner, have them every year? When Macron can go to China and Boris Johnson will do so soon after he's elected, if he's re-elected Prime Minister. Why has Australia got to sacrifice the opportunity of a pragmatic, tough-minded, realist relationship with China to appease Washington, which is capable of doing a big trade deal overnight which locks out our exports? In the same spirit, I guess you could say it's what we're doing with Russia.
We no longer have an independent foreign policy. Our foreign policy is basically made by the Five Eyes countries, led by America and Britain as their loyal lieutenant. Canada and Australia and New Zealand tag along behind like obedient little puppies wagging their tails.
It gets described in the press as an alliance, the Five Eyes alliance.
Yes.
Not at all an alliance.
Well, it is actually. It's a sort of an unspoken alliance. It's our most important foreign policy relationship, unfortunately. Foreign policy isn't made in the Department of Foreign Affairs anymore. It's made in the defence and intelligence agencies, and it's entirely Five Eyes. And just to come back to Bob's earlier point about did we miss an opportunity to separate Russia from China, I think we had that opportunity briefly when Yeltsin was a very weak and feckless president of Russia, and America was well on the way to putting Russia in the position of a compliant, weak state. But the genius of Putin, and the man is a genius, when he came to office, he set about getting Russia off its knees, restoring Russia's self-respect, restoring Russian pride and self-confidence, and Putin would have never fallen for it.
Okay, let's go to you for questions. Thank you, Tony. There's plenty to talk about. Just ask simple, short, direct questions, please. Sir.
On what basis do you say that Clinton was a warmonger? And are you saying also that Russia did not help cook the elections in favor of Trump?
I'm saying that Hillary Clinton was a warmonger because of the way in which she reacted with obvious glee to the murder of Gaddafi, to the killing of Osama bin Laden in questionable circumstances, to her general attitude to foreign policy, which I find militaristic and aggressive from everything she said publicly. The Mueller report found nothing to show that Russia helped Trump get elected. Putin has denied it. Putin has admitted that there might have been some Russians who did things they shouldn't have. But as I said, it's a complex country.
Okay, another question. Alison.
Thanks, Tony. I'm really interested to hear your comments on the oligarchs, and particularly like someone like Khodorkovsky, and then the Internet Research Agency.
When you adopt a capitalist system, as Russia did in the 1990s, you're going to get millionaires. Whether you call them millionaires or oligarchs, it's really just a question of language. We have them in Australia too. What is Gina Reinhardt if not an oligarch? What is Frank Lowy if not an oligarch? I could go on. Just look at the 10 richest business people in Australia. Pick up a copy of the Financial Review. They're oligarchs. There were two generations of oligarchs in Russia. There was the first generation who were basically sucking all the wealth they could out of the country as quickly as they could and putting it in places like London and New York. And there were the oligarchs who, after Putin came in, decided we are going to be patriotic oligarchs, we're going to work with the government, and we're going to basically keep our money in Russia mostly and give back to the country. This is not new. This goes back to Tsarist times. The great industrial revolution of Russia in the late 19th century, it's in my book, Return to Moscow, was led and financed by oligarchs who were loyal to the Tsarist system. Every country chooses the form of government it wants. It's not the business of other countries to basically pass judgment, unless, of course, there are severe human rights violations on how a country runs itself. What was the second part of your question?
The Internet Research Agency.
Yeah, the Internet Research Agency. I'm not even sure what that is.
That we hear about.
Well, what do we hear? Give it me in one word.
In the mainstream press, that they're researching ways to pervert elections.
All right. Well, I don't know about that one, but I do know about the Institute for Statecraft and the Integrity Initiative, who are very well funded in London with people who've been to Oxford and Eton and so on, and who know information technology very well, and they know how to manipulate public opinion. And there's a lot of stuff in my second book, Russia and the West, about that. So I don't think the Russians have anything to teach us about that. I think the West is really ahead of the game on all that, unfortunately.
Alison.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks, Tony. As a long-time fellow traveller of yours, perhaps I can ask a more personal question, because both of your books are based on a really personal take on Russia, as you've said. And one of our other fellow travellers is the redoubtable blogger in Melbourne, Caitlin Johnston, who said yesterday, "To become oppositional to the status quo is to enter into a long-term relationship with despair." Would you like to comment on the experience?
I had the pleasure of launching this book in Melbourne a week ago with Katie Johnson, whom I hadn't met before. She's half my age. She's about as Australian as you get, went to a Brigidine convent school, lives in the suburbs, has 2 kids. She had to pick one of them up from netball. Just a wonderful, refreshing, open-minded Australian outside the Canberra, what you might call the Canberra bubble. She's brilliant, and I urge you all to seek out Caitlin Johnston at KGOS and read her, because she is an antidote to the disinformation we are fed. Do I get depressed sometimes? A little bit. I get angry, because I think anger is a more productive emotion than depression. I'm angry that I was able to have quite a good reputation as a dissident author, writing about things like hundreds of asylum seekers being drowned at sea because of a studied negligence on the part of Australian border protection agencies, coming from Canberra, not from the Navy, both under the Liberal government of Howard and under Labor governments of Rudd and Gillard, and Rudd again. People were drowning in numbers that they should not have been drowning. And I wrote 2 books about that. I always had a welcome in mainstream media and on the ABC, even though I was touching on difficult subjects. But now, since I started writing about Russia 3 years ago, I feel that the shutters have gone down. I've stepped outside the Chomsky envelope of what one is allowed to argue about in Australia's democracy. I'm in the grounds now where it's unwise to open your mouth, and I've paid the consequences for that. And some of my friends, or my former friends, have been very uncomfortable with the position I've put myself in, but I'm not going to change.
Is media groupthink the best way of summing up the mentality you're talking about? That there are people, ABC and Fairfax, as much as News Limited, not being able to think outside the group consensus?
It is, and I think you have to ask a deeper layer of questioning. Why? I think it comes from fear, partly. We do live in a system now where promotion prospects and so on depend on not rocking the boat too much. And I think there is now, in the ABC certainly, there's a real fear of engaging with me. Let me just say that I tried to get onto every ABC regional station when I had launches in Canberra, Melbourne, Brisbane and now Sydney, and every regional station declined to have any contact with me, quite different from my previous experience. Only Philip Adams, to his great credit, Philip Adams' Late Night Live, did a good, civilised 15-minute conversation with me, which you can hear on ABC Replay. Now, I think the ABC made a policy decision. We're going to give Tony Kevin 1 exposure so that he can't say the ABC turned their back on him. I'm grateful for that 1 exposure. Thank you, ABC. Meanwhile, the ABC continues to pump out the most incredible anti-Russian propaganda, and it's really infected the organisation. If anybody's heard of a young fellow called Matthew Bevan, who I invited here tonight. Is Matthew here tonight? Oh, Matthew's not here tonight. What a shame. I did invite him. He runs a blog called Russia If You're Listening. It's the most meretricious propaganda, full of lies, a little kernel of truth surrounded by a very large layer of lies. He's been well trained. And this is the environment we live in.
Question here.
Thank you, Bob and Kevin, both tonight for coming. It's a question for the both of you. In your perspectives, what would be the most ideal circumstance for Australian relations with China in the next 20, 30 years?
With China?
With China, correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to see Australia have a pragmatic policy with China that enables us to talk about our differences and to maximise opportunities. If we had the sort of relationship we had up until the anti-China tilt that took hold in early 2017, I'm talking about the relationship that was there under Abbott after his initial mistakes, we'd be able to talk to China candidly now about the South Pacific. We'd be able to say, foreign minister to foreign minister, look, Wang Yi, I speak for Australia, these are the red lines we've got in the South Pacific. We're concerned about these characteristics of your aid policy. We don't want you building any underwater cables. These are other concerns. Our relationship with Australia is more important than your relationship with Vanuatu, so let's talk about this agenda. Or we could be saying to them, we've been careful in our comments about Hong Kong. We recognise that Hong Kong is Chinese territory, but we do think restraint all round is the way to go. And we do think you should offer a vision for maintaining a separate Hong Kong system, not only now, but beyond 2047. For example, I just offer those two examples, the Pacific and Hong Kong. Right now, we can't have that relationship with China, that tough-minded realist relationship. We can't have it because we've made ourselves so adversarial that while Japan can have a working relationship with China, and Xi is going to visit Japan next year, it seems, and while India, an American partner, can have a bilateral, can have a summit with China once a year and discuss its differences and its commonalities, Australia can't. We've gone out of our way to elevate differences with the country that buys 40% of everything we export, and a country that is not going to have less influence but more influence in the region to our north. And I'm talking about discussing differences as well as anything else. So I just think I'm pessimistic, and I think some of the things that Tony's spoken about when it comes to media groupthink have operated in Australia-China relations, but much more vigorously because there's more at stake and there's more American pressure.
Do you think Russia should have been a bit more recognised, a lot more recognised for their fight in the Second World War against Nazi army and breaking the backs of that great army in the Second World War?
Yes.
Quick answer. Maybe we can sneak one more question.
Tony.
Thank you for inviting me, Tony. I've got a question for you about Russia. President Macron said that NATO is brain dead. Turkey is buying missiles from Russia. From your perspective, is the US winning or losing, or the Russian winning or losing?
In respect of Turkey?
In respect to whatever you like to say.
I think Russia and China are winning. I think that's implicit in the whole thesis of my second book, that we are missing opportunities by not engaging in proper diplomacy to have an order of states, which was what we tried to set up in 1945 after the elimination of the Nazi aggression. It was a system of collective security which was supposed to guarantee the security of all states, large and small. And when we, the West, renege on that system, as we have done for the last few years, we are leaving Russia and China as the defenders of the global collective security system. And naturally, a great many of the other countries we've been talking about, Japan, India, Pakistan, Iran, even the Middle Eastern Arab countries, are seeing the advantage to them in opening lines of dialogue to Russia and China. And we are left in a little rump of states. We are losing.
Tony, that's been a splendid contribution from you. I think I speak for everyone here when I congratulate you on your courage in standing up against the enforced orthodoxy that says improved relations with Russia are something we cannot talk about in Australia because Washington wouldn't allow it. That seems to be just for the record, because I wouldn't be surprised if they're a bit of a challenge to me for being here on this occasion and performing this with you. I don't endorse all your views on the Scribbles and MH17 and on Crimea. I've delineated that and I've got a different perspective. But the last day I had as Foreign Minister of this country of ours, Australia, I was honoured. Galina was there with me, working for the Australian Embassy in Petersburg. I represented Australia at the G20, hosted by Putin, and distinguished by, yes, some quite brilliant performances by Putin. My last day as your Foreign Minister, as Australian Foreign Minister, was in the Great War Cemetery in Petersburg, laying a wreath. The people of Australia had voted overnight. I was in a government voted out of power. This is my last function, to stand there in a cemetery that was the home for 500,000 Russians who died in the siege of Leningrad. And I can't tell you how honoured I was in this sunny weather. It was a freakishly hot September day, wasn't it?
Yes.
The sweat was on my brows. I walked there with a wreath. On behalf of the Australian people, my last function as your foreign minister, to lay a wreath paying tribute to these heroes. And it was their endurance, their capacity for endurance and survival against the odds that saw the death camps liberated, that saw the killing machine of the Nazis end, which ended Hitler's and Himmler's ambition of murdering all the Jews and then putting other people through the death camps and the gas chambers. The heroism of those Russians who, and this is a sweet story, when their thrust under Zhukov's leadership brought them into Germany, into German territory, they looked at the beautiful farms, they looked at the beautiful villages with their gardens, and they thought, why do these people, these Germans, with so much, want to invade other countries who have relatively little? So let's end tonight by saying that if the West didn't go to that anniversary in Moscow of the war, we are all with Russia in spirit, acknowledging the suffering of its people in that victory of 1945. In that spirit, let's give friendship and cooperation, pragmatism and realism a chance to survive. Thank you very much.